All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Wine Spectator two-bottle tasting. My name is Keith Goldston. I am the corporate master sommelier for Lanes Incorporated, small little family-run company, Tone Fertitta. You may have heard of them. So we've got a few restaurants out there and things like Mastro's, Morton's, Ocean Air, Rainforest Cafe, Bubba Gump. The list goes on. But anyways, I'm very lucky and very fortunate to work for such a dynamic company. I passed my master sommelier exam way back in 2001. So I like to refer to myself as a sommosaurus back when it wasn't trendy or cool to be a sommelier. But I feel very fortunate that there's a career and industry out there. And I'm even more honored that I get a chance to work with a great sommelier by the name of Travis Hinkle. Travis, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, hi everyone. As Keith said, my name is Travis. You're joining me today from the 25th floor at the Post Oak Hotel in Uptown Park of Houston, where I'm the beverage director. Keith and I started working together a little over 3 years ago now. It's been a whirlwind of 3 years, but we're really proud of what we've done here, culminating with winning the Wine Spectator Grand Award, which we're very honored to receive in 2019. So great team here, great team of sommeliers. And of course, with wonderful insight from Keith Goldston, who works here on campus too. So we're thrilled to bring this to you today.
All right. So Travis, I know we're going to kind of come at this tasting from a sommelier perspective. I guess for me, what'd be really curious is, I know you have an art background. How did you end up in wine? What led you to become a sommelier in the first place?
Well, if you've ever worked in restaurants, you'll know that there's actually a lot of artistically inclined people who end up in restaurants because, frankly, the options, if you go to a humanities or an art degree, are kind of limited to you. And you're already predisposed to enjoying fine things. All right. And so working in a restaurant was a great way for me to learn more about food. And I first fell into wine through the food angle. I grew up with parents who loved to cook. I've always loved to eat. And so when I started working in fine dining restaurants, the way that you really become that top tier server is by learning about wine. And it turned out that many of those same things that I appreciated about great food were present. And for me, even more exciting in exploring great wine. And so I haven't looked back. I've been doing this for about 12 years and wake up pinching myself every morning for sure.
Awesome. Well, I know for me, I've got this really curious mind. And maybe it was growing up in Napa out in the country and, like reading encyclopedias for fun. But for me, wine is this amazing world where you can combine history, geography, geology with the senses. So for me, this two-bottle tasting is really kind of cool because you and I, when we sit down and taste with reps, it's great because they bring in multiple bottles. And for me, it's always this comparison of like, what is this wine trying to do? Is it a good version of it? And does it offer a good value for that price point? So I love when you can actually have comparisons. And I think, it's not necessarily one's better than another. It's actually two's just better than one. It gives you more reference points, more data points, more things to taste and put it all into context. So, Travis, do you like tasting two bottles or, probably like 4 or 5, but
Yeah, always. And even, obviously in a restaurant context, I love being able to move on from a sparkling wine into a white wine and then finishing up with red or even a dessert and fortified wine. And again, it's not about drinking more necessarily. It's about having that experience of moving through categories, through different weights and textures and flavors throughout the course of the meal. But even if I'm enjoying something casual at home, I love having a white and a red open. If for no other reason, then I think white and red serve different functions at the table, and they play off of even the same dish in different ways. So again, that doesn't mean you have to down the whole bottle in one night, but it does mean that having two things open and side by side, I think enhances any meal and gives you appreciation of whatever wine you happen to be drinking that night.
Yeah, great point. I know a lot of people out there get really kind of apprehensive sometimes, like, oh, I don't want to open up too much wine. But at least for me, there's almost always a half bottle in the fridge. It's not that hard just to put the cork back in, have it the next night. All right. So Travis, who are we tasting today? What are these two bottles?
So I'm really excited to be joined by Hahn Winery. They're based in Monterey County of California, but really we're pioneers in the Santa Lucia Highlands, which has become regarded as perhaps the top growing region in Monterey County. And so today we're excited to taste their 2018 Chardonnays and Pinot Noir, kind of their signature SLH blend meant to represent the entire appellation of Santa Lucia Highlands.
Yeah, and I might lose my, napkin status talking nicely about another region in California, but it is really a magical place. I mean, it's just a few miles south of San Francisco, and California is blessed with these just amazing coastal mountains. And there's the great Central Valley where almost everything grows. But then before you get to the Central Valley, there's a couple spots where there's little almost coastal valleys. And the Salinas one is one of these famous magical spots where almost everything grows. But what's really super cool is it's only like 8 miles from the coast. And then if you go a little bit further out on the coast, there is this just amazing, they call it the Blue Grand Canyon, where basically it's a mile deep and 2 miles wide. So you have some very cold, very, very deep water. There's this amazing abundance of sea life. And side note, if you're ever going down to wine country, do the side trip to the Monterey Aquarium. It is awesome, one of the greatest aquariums in the world. Anyone who's seen Finding Dory, that's where it's at. And just another side note, really underrated sequel. That was really good. I digress. Going back to those super cold, super deep waters, basically, if you get any warmth inland, it's going to pull that cold air into the valleys. And the way that Santa Lucia Highlands is on the mountains, and it's just a straight shot kind of diagonally north into the west, right to Monterey Bay. And it's just this perfect funnel to suck in all the cold air of the fog, the marine layer, and just cool off the grapes every day. So it works great for that. And then it's also kind of amazing because it works as a rain block. And it's shocking how much rain is on the west side. And then if you just go over the mountains, I think they average like 13 inches of rain a year, which is almost nothing. That's almost like desert. So it's a really unique spot. And like you've seen those great images of like the fog blowing into San Francisco. In this case, imagine it rolling right into the vineyards. So for me, it's a pretty special spot. And it's really interesting because, what about the history of it? I mean, I know Nicky Hahn was one of the first to kind of plant Santa Lucia Highlands, but there were grapes there before, right? Or in the area.
Yeah, grapes have been planted there really since Spanish missions. And so, of course, California has a long and sort of illustrious wine history, even before Prohibition. Prohibition, of course, sort of puts a damper on the entire industry. And it wasn't really until, say, the 60s, and in the case of Monterey County, the 70s, where you really begin to see viticulture reemerging from the damage that Prohibition did. The Hahn family started, I believe, in 1979, so the late 70s, but committed first to Cabernet, like many families were doing in California at the time. But being pioneers in the area, they got a sense of the land even more. So within the first decade or so, began experimenting with cool climate grape varieties. And, with inheriting our sort of inspiration from France, that really means Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And so around the time that you see Pinot Noir and Chardonnay going in, Santa Lucia Highlands, because its own America viticultural area, so it's recognized as one of our prestigious growing regions. And in that 40 years since then, you've really seen the quality just absolutely skyrocket. So it's great to see what the Hahn family has been a part of, and our winemaker, Paul, who'll be joining us shortly, should be able to fill us in more on that history.
Yeah, and thank you, Travis. It is also fascinating, and I think a lot of people, it's so easy just to go Napa, Sonoma, and kind of put them up on the pedestal, but there were some legendary wines coming out of this area, for many, many years. If you go way back into the day, the Martin Ray Pinots of Santa Cruz were legendary. I mean, supposedly Romanée-Conti cuttings, and Fred Dame tells an amazing story of being at the Cannery, a great restaurant in Monterey, and opening a bottle from the 1920s. And he said for like the first 10 seconds, it was the greatest smelling Pinot we ever had. And then it died in like 20 seconds. But it had 10 seconds of glory. So there were great Pinots coming out of the area. If anyone's been lucky enough to have some of the old Chalon Chardonnays or the Chenin Blanc, if you're really lucky. And that's just a few miles inland from Santa Lucia Highlands, basically in the next, a little valley tucked away in the next range that then takes you into the Central Valley, the Gavilan Mountains. So Chalon was making great stuff. You have the Ridge Montebello Vineyard. So that it's not that surprising that there can be really high quality stuff coming out of here, but it just seems like this little stretch, 18 miles, running north, hillside vineyards that start kind of low. I think Hahn Vineyard's lowest elevation is like 200 feet going up to 1,200 feet. But the idea of this kind of ridge line that runs north to south, Vineyards kind of going up a gentle slope. Kind of sounds like the Côte d'Or in Burgundy, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And something magic happens when you combine that cool climate growing region with various elevations on slopes. And this is really where, again, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay tends to perform best.
Yeah, well, I don't know about you, but I'm getting kind of thirsty. Should we dive in and try these wines? See what
Yeah,
they
let's
taste
jump
like?
into it. Start with Chardonnay, yeah?
Yeah, you're driving the bus, so.
So, one of the things we touched on a little bit earlier, which I, expect to find in this wine is we've got, again, we've said it before, a cool climate growing region where that cool Pacific Ocean is bringing in all of that cool weather, but you combine that with a really sunny climate as well. And so what that does is really extend the growing season. So we've got a good degree of ripeness while maintaining that acidity, which keeps the wine refreshing. So in just smelling this wine, it smells like great California Chardonnay. So you get those ripe tropical flavors of grilled pineapple, melon, peach, baked apple almost.
Yeah, and just to clarify for the people out there that don't speak, wine geek speak, the whole cool climate for me was always just a great way to think about this is as grapes ripen, sugar levels, well, first off, it starts with the acid levels high, sugar levels low. And as ripening happens, usually sugar goes up and acid goes down. But if you can kind of stretch out that growing season, you can sneak the ripeness up without that acid dropping. And typically speaking, your cooler spots, you can hold on to that acid longer with higher levels of ripeness. So it's this kind of balanced dance. And if anyone's ever had like a banana, like there's one day you're like, nope, not ready. But then like 2 days later, you're like, it's brown, it's mushy, it's flabby and gross. So finding that kind of window of perfect balance between the acid sugar is why a lot of us kind of get so excited about that cool climate, because it's also just like a perfect lemonade. It's this balance of sugar and acid, crispness that works so well. And then also too, the other thing that's really kind of unique, this area is famous because it is open to the Pacific. So they get this wind that blows almost every day. And there's just a little bit of phenolic kind of chewiness. And, you can almost taste the thicker skins. And there's just something about the ripening process there that the grapes in this area just get a little bit thicker skinned. And I'm sure Paul will attest to this later, that when you're making wine, a lot of the flavors come from the skins. And there's just this little bit of extra kind of, bitterness that's not necessarily the oak that I kind of like balances that pineapple, baked apple, and that wonderful kind of honey notes that show through too.
And I'm glad you mentioned that oak too, because, we've talked about fruit, we've talked about these sort of textural and bitter components in it. But what I really appreciate about Hahn Chardonnay is its sort of balanced and judicious approach to French oak. And that's coming through to me with just this suggestion of vanilla, a little bit of toast, smoke. And more than anything, what really well-seasoned French oak does is just lift the whole wine up aromatically. It almost gives flight to all the other things that are going on in the wine, makes it a little bit more savory. And again, that impression of complexity that comes with it.
Yeah, well, and the other thing, and, kind of playing on my Bay Area roots, what I love about Chardonnay, and particularly one like this, is there's a richness and weight to it. So you can use it for a lot of things. And, we'll talk about food pairings later, but it gives you tons of flexibility, but it's kind of big enough though to hang in with like red meats, things that you'd normally drink red wine with. And it's kind of fun that it has this richness, but elegance. And to me, I kind of think of, there was a great San Francisco giant, Pablo Sandoval, and they referred to him as the Kung Fu Panda because he was a little bit round, and but he moved with amazing grace. And to me, this Chardonnay kind of walks that line of like, it's big enough that you could definitely just have this for the whole meal, but it's also kind of refreshing and could totally crush it at lunch.
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect.
Should we dive into the red, see what that tastes like?
Yeah, let's do it. And so to review, the red wine we're tasting today is Hahn Winery SLH Pinot Noir 2018. And so right away, hard for our viewers to probably see here, but in the glass, it's just this absolutely gorgeous, pale ruby red color. I can see straight through it if I'm peering down through the glass. And again, that's classic for this thin-skinned, really elegant grape variety Pinot Noir.
So wait, Travis, it can still be good even though it's light in color?
Yeah, believe it or not, a deeper color does not necessarily make a better wine. And for me, Pinot Noir, you want to be a little suspicious of it if it's too dark. Pinot for me is meant to show off that really beautiful, translucent kind of character to it.
Yeah. Well, and I've also find like sometimes, when you get those bigger, kind of inkier, extracted red wines, it's kind of like death metal music. Like it's just loud and powerful in your face. Whereas like Pinot Noir, Nebbiolo, which might be lighter in color, they're a little bit more haunting and nuanced. And, it's kind of like that, that opera playing in the background that just will, you fall asleep to later, or it's like playing in your head, just kind of haunts you. So don't be thrown off by the color.
Absolutely. Cool. What I love about this Pinot Noir, and this is for me indicative of great Pinot Noir in general, is you have this wonderful red fruit kind of character to it. So for me, that means ripe red cherries, red raspberries, and currants. Here in California, where we have that ripeness and that sun-kissed kind of character to it, it's almost ventures into ripe strawberries or even strawberry jam.
Yeah, well, and I love that, but then there's also this a little bit more primal earthy thing that comes through for me on Pinot Noir, and it's like beets. And like as a kid, totally hated beets, but like as you get older, like beets are the jam. Like there is just this cool kind of earthy, sweet thing, and it's almost kind of beets going into mushroom, and it's kind of a fun little play. The same way that you have that little bit of skin bitterness on the Chardonnay, playing off the sweetness of the fruit. I kind of like that beet mushroom thing that comes through to play off the strawberry, and if anyone's ever had like strawberry rhubarb pie, it's that kind of just nice balance between the two.
Yep, and that herbal character I think is intermingling with the earth. And here, that's not. This is herbal notes that are at the height of a perfectly made ripe wine. So for me, if you grow tomatoes at home, it reminds me just a little bit of tomato leaf. It's that very herbal kind of note to it.
And it's funny, it's on the nose, I get that, but then on the palate, for me, it goes a little bit more into like sarsaparilla, almost kind of root beer, cola nut. But, and just to Paul, who we'll bring in just a second, I mean, that's just really well-made wine. And there's just a smoothness that I could see a lot of bottles getting consumed very quickly, where you're like, oh, what happened to the bottle? And I mean that in the best possible way. So Travis, if you were tasting these and thinking about putting these on like the Grand Award wine list, like the Post Oak Masters, what things jump out at you that'd be like, okay, this is why I'd want this on that slot on the wine list?
Yeah, just talking generally first, I think for me, when we're purchasing, we're looking for good examples from the region, because a guest will be coming in and hopefully me or one of our sommeliers has an opportunity to talk them through each individual wine. But more likely, they'll be ordering something off the list that we've arranged by category, hoping that it tastes like the place where it comes from. The thing I appreciate about these wines is they taste like California wines, right? They're unapologetically ripe, they're fruit forward, they're just absolutely irresistibly delicious with those kind of flavors, but they're not so over the top that you can't finish the whole bottle. And so for me, that's partially skilled winemaking, and then partially just the nature of Santa Lucia Highlands, adding that dose of acidity that comes from growing in a cool region like this. So for me, this is something that's great to be enjoyed from the first sip and then all the way through the course of a meal. And that's what I appreciate about them as a buyer.
Yeah, and I would just add to that to me, this is a really good example of this area. Like if I was to go up to Russian River, it would be a little bit hotter. The fruit would be jammier. Going down to Santa Barbara, I get a little bit more blue fruits, and there's just a purity to the red fruits on this that to me really kind of speaks to this area. And then also too, I mean, besides little things like that, the brand loyalty also helps a little bit. And like you and I both know that, one of our boss, Tillman Fertitta's, like one of his best friends throughout the years, Laura Ward, like the SLH Chardonnay is her favorite wine in the world. So that is also part of it. Sometimes it's like, we got to have it on the list because Laura Ward's going to come in and we're going to get lit up by Tillman if we don't have it. So there is something to be said about listen to your guest, and also if you love a wine, that's just dig in your heels. And it's like, it's like the saying, like dance as if no one's watching you. If there's a wine you love, just crank it up and drink it. So, Travis, should we bring in Paul?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we feel really fortunate. We've got Paul Clifton, the winemaker from Hahn. He's been with them since 2003. So welcome, Paul.
Oh, thank you guys for having me. I'm always blown away talking to people like you and your profession, and how much knowledge you guys have of all these different AVAs. Thank you for all you do for the industry. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us.
So, I guess, walk us through, like, what's your day-to-day life, as a winemaker? That's a pretty glamorous kind of cool job title. And there, at least for me, as like, a generation in California, like wine industry wasn't really an option for like career, like you're like, oh, I'm going to be a policeman, politician. Like winemaker was probably not on that list, or was it for you as a kid?
No, not at all. It wasn't until I was 23 or so that I got involved with wine through basically through some old family heritage where they made wine during Prohibition. You're talking about Prohibition. Well, we had this house in Salinas here where they had a basement, and they actually had false walls where they hid the booze and the wine. And so I saw that equipment down there, and that's kind of how I got involved with making wine at home. And then moved on from business degree. I went into firefighting for a while. I thought that was going to be my stint. And then I started making wine at home. I was like, man, there's just like an unlimited amount of information to absorb and to learn. And that's how I kind of got in the business, and started out as a cellar worker and kind of worked my way up the ladder from there.
Nice. And
yeah, it's been
and I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but I know that if I remember correctly, the Hahn family actually has Swiss roots as well too. So
yeah, they're Swiss German, and so I went back to school and I got a postgraduate degree in viticulture. And at the time, my mentor called me back. I was coming back from New Zealand. That's where I went to school. And he's like, hey, there's the Hahn family has a beautiful property, and they want to go to Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and go visit them. So I went out and met Nicky, and Nicky was he was one of the first ones. Him and Rich Smith, McFarland family were the first to really plant up on that bench in the Lucia Highlands. And back then there was a lot of experimenting going on, and Nicky realized this bench was very different than the valley floor. Those of you that have been to California and driven 101 have probably driven right through one of the biggest row crop producing areas in the country. And you wouldn't realize it, but you look up to the west on that mountainside, and it's perfect for growing grapes. You can't grow crops up there, or row crops up there. It's just the soils are too granulated and sandy, and Nicky realized that, and so he said, hey, he got together with his neighbors and said, hey, let's form an AVA. This should be something separate from the Monterey AVA. So he kind of initiated hiring a geologist to come out and map the area out. And when I got there, I was like, it's like a playground of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. It's amazing place.
Yeah, and speaking of that playground, how do you handle single vineyards versus blends? Because I know you guys have 4 great single vineyards. How?
Yeah, and there's within each vineyard, it's almost like within each vineyard there's multiple vineyards, because you're looking at different blocks and a different terrain and different aspects, and that's I came from very boutique when I started out as a cellar worker, and then assistant winemaker, and then winemaker for other companies. They're all very boutique. And so when I got to Hahn, I'm looking at not a boutique. We farm a lot of property up there in the Lucia Highlands, and I wanted to learn more about each piece, So the only way you could do that is by farming it separate, farming it all the same, but really making the wines, keeping the wines separate throughout the vinification process. So you learn what each sub block within each vineyard is doing, what each clone's doing. And so it probably drives my cellar team nuts, but we've got 60, 70 different lots of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay out in the cellar. Just trying to learn what each piece is doing and, how they're, whether a clone's working or not, or, whether farming practices are working or not. That's how you discover where the gems are, but also where the dogs are. And then you try to sort them out that way. Versus if you just took all the grapes and you put them in a big tank together, and you wouldn't know, you wouldn't know what block is doing well and which one's not. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Really,
and also presumably after harvest and you've gone through and begun to make these wines, you end up with lots of different pieces of different vineyards in the winery, and then you're using those pieces and combining them every vintage to try to blend together your SLH blends. What are you trying to achieve when you're putting those pieces together to make them representative of this brand and this place?
Well, so the Lucia Highlands kind of unique in terms of you guys mentioned it's about 15 miles long and about 2 miles wide, stretching northwest to southeast, north to south. In the northern part of the AVA, you get more fog and less wind, and the fruit. I'll talk about Pinot Noir specifically here, but you get not as much color, not as much structure, a little thinner skin, and more elegant Pinot. And as you move further south, the fog will burn off earlier in the morning, and you'll get exposure to the sun. You'll get photosynthesis or sugar being pumped into the grapes earlier than you are in the north. But you have more of an influence of wind further south. And the wind plays a huge impact on the grape, on the grapevine. Basically, you have the wind, once you hit about 15 knots, the wind's blowing over the tops of the leaves, it'll actually stop photosynthesis or the sugar being pumped into the grapes. So the grapes are hanging there in the sun, no sugar being pumped in, but allows the phenolics to develop, allows the seed to ripen, allows the color in the skin to develop more. So you end up with more of a voluptuous type of Pinot Noir as you move further south. So for the SLH Pinot, it's a really good representation of the AVA, just because we have vineyard holdings all throughout the AVA, north and south.
Cool. And then speaking of Pinot Noir, it sounds like, there's this, depending on the block, certain ways you have to treat the Pinot Noir. As the winemaker, do you have a preference for Chardonnay or Pinot? Which one's your favorite child? Which one's the problem child?
Oh, God, they're so different. Chardonnay is much more winemaker influence in terms of all the different styles there are out there, and it kind of drives me nuts. And I really strive to keep the SLH Chardonnay a balanced style. It's got a little bit of oak. I don't want to cover that up with, cover all the tropical fruit and citrus that you're smelling up with French oak. So it's really maintain that kind of balanced style Chardonnay. So, and that's what we'll continue to maintain. People are, a lot of times I'm out pouring with people and they're saying, oh, I don't like Chardonnay. I don't like Chardonnay, because they think of California Chardonnay as being super oaky. Well, if you can get a Chardonnay that's not super oaky in their mouth, it'll change their minds. And, that's what we're after with the SLH Chardonnay.
Well, I think it's pretty funny that there's so many people that are like, oh, I don't like Chardonnay, yet it's the most widely planted grape in the world. So just saying.
Yeah. And the Pinot, that's my true love. I think it expresses, it tells you the truth about the land. It tells the truth. What I mean by that is you can't take Pinot and like Cabernet, if it's kind of weak, you might blend a tea straw in there or something, and it'll doll it up. It'll still smell and taste like Cabernet. Pinot Noir, the second you blend anything into it, it's going to be obvious to anyone that knows wine. That's what I love about it. It tells you the truth about the piece of land that you're farming, the climate or the weather that you have during the growing season, and the people that are working it.
Cool. Well, Paul, I know you've been with Hahn since 2003. So what would you say is the biggest changes you've seen? I mean, we're like in the industry. I mean, obviously these are unique times right now, currently, but over the last, 17 years, what have you seen as like the biggest changes for your tiny little area and winery?
It's been, when I first started in 2003, there was already a buzz happening. We had, some investors from Napa come down and Chuck Wagner, and that kind of opened up a lot of eyes to what the potential is. And then Gary Francione and Garrett Pizzoni came on and started farming and really got some great accolades. And it just raised awareness of everybody in the region about what the quality potential is. So that was a big change. Gary and the two Garys started getting great accolades that raised awareness of the AVA, and everybody started farming for quality. So that was the biggest change I saw was, the Hahn family reinvesting a fortune into converting a lot of their vineyards from other varieties into Pinot Noir and Chardonnay.
To Travis and I, that's super fascinating. And especially now, like as things are, looking towards the future, do you see maybe Cabernet coming back at some point, or, is there any concern about that, or is there any experimentation with other grapes?
I've got this one colleague of mine that's like, hey, a couple more years we could, because we grafted a lot of old Cabernet vines over to Pinot, and he's like, we could just cut the Pinot off and let the Cabernet come out. I'm like, no, man, no. I'm not really worried yet about climate change. We are seeing more kind of Indian summer heat spikes, which is like September, October, right when you're in harvest. But the other wind patterns and the fog patterns are not changing dramatically, as long as the ocean stays the temperature it is, which is typically 50, 55 degrees. That governs our nighttime temperature, which helps preserve that acidity you guys are talking about.
Yeah. Well, I was fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you look on it, to work 10 years in Las Vegas. And we had a saying there that you don't mess with a winning streak. And I would say that Chardonnay Pinot is on a pretty good winning streak right there. So maybe run with that as long as you can.
Well, but that being said, yeah, sorry, Keith, just jumping in. I mean, that being said, with, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay being the king and queen of Santa Lucia Highlands, are there any other grapes that are currently grown or that are being messed around with that you're excited about? I know there's some great Syrah that comes from there and some other stuff. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, we do Syrah, and Grenache is phenomenal up there. That's one I'm really excited about. We planted some in right about when I started, about 2004 or 5, a couple of years after. We planted a small block of Grenache as a test, and have expanded since. And it's a phenomenal grape variety up there.
Well, awesome.
Fantastic.
Yeah, well, I know like we could geek out about wine, vineyards, clones, soil types, all of that stuff. But for me, wine, unless you have company and food, that's when it really shows at its best. So, Paul, what are your like two favorite? I mean, like when you're hosting people at the winery or putting together, what's your favorite things to drink with your wine or eat with your wines?
I am. Well, it's interesting. 10 months ago, I decided to go plant-based for medical reasons, but every couple weeks, man, I gotta take a big steak and throw it on the try. I just can't survive without it. Tri-tip on the grill it's amazing with the Pinot especially. The Chardonnay, I really like. Salmon season's in right now, local salmon, and it goes really well with the Chardonnay.
Fantastic. Travis, I know that you were working with one of our concepts. What were the pairings that you and the team at McCormick and Tress came up with?
Yeah, so we've got two dishes paired with the Chardonnay. We've put together a really delicious grilled peach and burrata salad. And I think that's perfect because burrata is that fresh mozzarella that has this wonderful creaminess and just this great fresh cheese character that plays great off the oak notes and then the creaminess in the Chardonnay. But then also with the stone fruits and the little bit of char that you pick up from it's being grilled, it works really wonderfully with the right flavors of California Chardonnay. So that's what we've chosen for the white wine. For the Pinot Noir, we are doing steak. So I'm pleased to hear Paul talk about grilling out on the steak. We've got a pepper-crusted ribeye, which holds up really, really wonderfully with this Pinot Noir. Being from California, you do get, it's not a wimpy Pinot Noir. It's still got some depth and body that can really stand up to red meat like that.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny. In this one, we're really lucky because we were able to use another concept as well, Chart House. And I know a lot of you, that's kind of one like those just great memories of going with the parents to Chart House, having some great seafood. So it was kind of funny. And Paul actually recommended to the chef there, salmon would be perfect with either of these. So of course the chef goes with a steak. But they went with a Mediterranean kind of mezzi platter, and for the Chardonnay. And to me, it's kind of it speaks to the testament of how flexible Chardonnay is, how it gives you that, weight to hold up to stuff, to handle stronger flavors. And for me personally, there's always been in my back of my mind, I kind of think of Fight Club. And the first rule of Fight Club, you don't talk about Fight Club. But anyways, that there really are no rules for food and wine pairing. There are guidelines. And for me, the most important guideline is to match the weight of the wine with the weight of the food. Because if one's really out of sync, it'll just get blown out of the water. And that's what I love about Chardonnay is it gives you that weight with the acid. So things like the Mediterranean platter, perfect with it. And then they went with a ribeye as well for the Pinot. And Travis's point is definitely a bigger Pinot. But it's also too, Pinot and steak is delicious. And, I think back many years ago working at a steakhouse, and I had one night where I'm like, I'm not going to sell a single bottle of Cab. And we had 29 tables and I sold 27 bottles of Pinot. And most of them came back and had Pinot again with it. So, don't be afraid. And like we talked earlier, with that lighter color, doesn't mean it can't hold up to a steak. Because there's also something nice about having a sip, having it be refreshing after a big, heavy piece of meat.
And I'd encourage those of you watching to really experiment, especially with these two grapes. You really can't mess up a pairing with Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. It is almost impossible. And so, I hope you're enjoying the meals that we prepared for you. But if you cook at home, mess around, try some things out. But if you bring stuff in too, try different cuisines with Asian cuisines, even with Indian. Pinot Noir and Chardonnay is just both incredibly versatile wines that will go well with just about everything.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Travis, that besides the weight with weight being the most important guideline, I'd say probably the second most important guideline would be intensity with intensity. Yep. And especially when you're playing with, Indian cuisine, Thai cuisine, cuisines that are intense, but maybe not necessarily that heavy. That for me is what Chardonnay can do, is they can give you intensity without being just syrupy big monsters. And especially with elegant winemaking, like what Paul has provided for us in these glasses. All right, well, Travis, that sounds delicious. I hope everyone that went and swung by McCormick and Schmidt enjoys the dinner. Everyone who went to the Chart House, I know you guys are in great shape. And as we kind of segue out of this 2-bottle tasting, we look forward to the next one. We definitely could not have done this without Paul. Paul, thank you for taking your time. Great wines. And
well, thank you guys.
Yeah, you're welcome. But
I really appreciate, what you guys do for all these kind of unknown AVAs throughout the world. It's impressive. So thank you for all you do.
You're welcome. And I would just
Our
like to
pleasure.
also say thank you for over delivering. And it's really easy to make great $200 bottles of wine. To be able to make really great wines that are at a price point that a lot of us can drink, I think is a lot harder. And I don't think you guys get enough credit for over delivering, making just great wine that we can all drink all the time. So thank you so much. Travis, anything you'd like to say in closing? But thank you. Always fun to taste with you.
It's been a pleasure, Keith. Thanks very much. And Paul, thank you. Everybody stay safe.